The following program has been pre-recorded, so please don't call in at this time. If you wish to participate in the program, tune in at 5 p.m. every Wednesday for A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Good evening, fellow humans. This is Wayne Parker with A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio, 96.9 FM here in Baton Rouge. We are a live call-in show here, so it's an open forum for anyone to call in and share their thoughts, topics, opinions, facts, corrections on the topic of the evening. And Lang Baker, as usual, is here with me again in the studio. Good evening, Lang.
Howdy, Wayne.
And the topic we decided to talk about tonight was labor relations, or the labor wars back around the late 19th, early 20th century here in the United States. And with the promo, if you heard it this past week, we wanted to talk about the Battle of Blair Mountain, which has been considered by some to have been the bloodiest armed uprising in the United States since the Civil War. I mean, at the time it was, and I guess it still is, really, now that I think of it. Unless you want to count the Watts riots and all that other stuff. But anyway, it started in Mingo, Logan, and McDowell counties in West Virginia, the United States, the big coal fields up there in the Appalachian Mountains. They had a lot of labor disputes going on at the time. They were non-union workers here in the mines, and they were all required to live in company towns. When company towns were basically, the company owned the towns and paid the workers in company currency or scrip, which could only be spent in the company towns. And the workers had to pay rent to the company in company scrip. They had to rent their tools from the company. And of course, so if the company town didn't have what they needed, they couldn't get it because they didn't have any cash to go elsewhere or anything. And of course, going elsewhere would have required them to travel, great distances. But anyway, Lang, I'd like to stop right there, though, and talk a little bit about company towns, what they were, and then we'll get a little bit more into the Battle of Blair Mountain and how things work. But
sounds good.
Okay. I've got a little article here from the Smithsonian. By the way, this live call-in show, 343-9927. I don't think I gave the number out. 343-9927 if you'd like to call in. Anyway, back to company towns. Company towns, this is from the Smithsonian. During the Industrial Revolution, they write, company towns, that is, communities built by businesses, sprouted up across the country. And according to this one guy, the author of the book, The Company Town, The Industrial Edens and Satanic Mills That Shaped the American Economy, Hardy Green says that the company towns range from the awful to the enviable. He says towns built by coal companies, for example, were often more on the prison camp end of the spectrum in terms of poverty and abuse. And then there was a place like Hershey, Pennsylvania, which was essentially a paradise for workers, built by the head of or the founder of the Hershey Chocolate Company in Pennsylvania. But it's important to note here that, and this article talks about it too, that a lot of the workers were recent immigrants. They couldn't speak very good English. They didn't know anything about our culture. They had no money. They had no social network because they left their families behind in Europe, and so they were easy prey to be abused by their employers, and they were. And a lot of people came to these towns from outside and would trick these people. And anyway, but company towns, first company town I want to talk about is Hershey, Pennsylvania. As I said, Milton Hershey in 1903 founded the Hershey Chocolate Company, and he built his town around his plant because he wanted to make it nice so that, because he also wanted to make it a tourist destination. He had an amusement park there and everything, but he wanted people to come and see just how happy and well cared for his workers were, the workers that were making their chocolate, because they were the big chocolate maker in the world, I guess, at the time, at least in America. But The company provided housing with indoor plumbing, central heating, lawns maintained by the Hershey Company itself, and other amenities. So it was really an ideal place to live. And then another company town was in Lowell, Massachusetts. It was a textile town, and they built the company town and recruited young single women and had them come in and work under not necessarily bad conditions, but they were pretty strict, and then they controlled their personal behavior and everything else. But then there was the Pullman in Illinois. Well, I'll wait on that one. Let's go back now. Okay, but those basically were company towns, and as Green mentioned here, up here, Hardy Green states, that the coal company towns were generally very abusive of the workers, and that brings us back to the Battle of Blair Mountain in West Virginia, Lang, and
yeah, well, the Battle of Blair Mountain was 1921, I believe, and actually that was, I guess you'd say, the high point or the peak in the labor organizing that had started in coal country in southern West Virginia back in a decade or so earlier. A fellow named Frank Keeney was principal organizer back in the strike of 1912-1913 down in southern West Virginia, and he played a role right through the decade or longer than a decade that went on. And he was inspired by Mother Jones, who was a union organizer from early on. She had come to the U.S. from Ireland, where her family left after the potato famine there, and she first went to Canada first and then to the U.S., and she started organizing with the United Mine Workers after the Haymarket riots in Chicago. She had lived in Chicago before, and so she came to West Virginia to help organize the miners there, and that's where she met Frank Keeney when he was still a teenager, and inspired him to participate in union organizing as well. But the incidents right around the time of the Battle of Blair Mountain started about a year or so before that, with in the town of Matewan, which was down south of there. And
yeah, I have here that the hostilities ramped up in 1920 when the United Mine Workers finally started to organize in Mingo County. And it was the town of Matewan.
Matewan in Mingo County.
Right.
Which was not a company town. That was a independent town with its own elected mayor and sheriff, appointed by the mayor. And the sheriff was Sid Hatfield, who was a distant relative of the famous Hatfield from the Hatfield and McCoy family feuds in West Virginia.
Question for you, though, and I didn't catch this before we went on to the show, but I've got here that the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency arrived at the town of Matewan to evict union miners from houses owned by the Stone Mountain Coal Company.
Right.
Okay.
There were coal mine workers living outside of town.
Okay.
And so the Felts, as the Baldwin Felts Agency,
right,
they had started as a detective agency and worked on solving railroad crimes and catching train robbers and stuff like that until that business kind of dried up, and then they went into becoming like the hired guns for the coal companies. They were involved not just in West Virginia but out in Colorado and other coal mining areas as well. But they had come to Matewan to evict some of the workers from these coal camps outside of town. When they came, well, I'll back up a minute. The mayor and the sheriff in Matewan were strong supporters of the unions. Mayor
Cabell Testerman and Sheriff Sid Hatfield, yes.
Exactly, yeah. And so they were supporters of the unions. And when one of the founders of this agency, Felts, two of his brothers were among the agents who had come to Matewan to perform these evictions. And when they came back to town, Sheriff Sid Hatfield presented them with arrest warrants. He was going to arrest the two Phelps brothers and put them in the jail there in Matewan. And so one of the Phelps brothers turned around and says, "Well, I've got an arrest warrant for you." So he tried to arrest the sheriff while the sheriff was trying to arrest him, and the mayor took a look at the warrant for the sheriff's arrest and said, "This is a bogus warrant." And then somebody started shooting, and that's when the battle or the massacre or whatever they called it by various names took place in Matewan. And so that led to the series of events that culminated with the Battle of Blair Mountain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and after that, okay, so, the mayor was killed in that. Sid Hatfield, the sheriff, was considered a hero, but they found a way to get him out of that county into...
Yeah, he was put on trial for murders in what happened in Matewan, and the jury acquitted him, and Phelps and his agency were outraged and seeking revenge for the killing of his two brothers. So they had Hatfield brought to trial in another county. When he showed up for the trial unarmed, he was assassinated on the steps of the courthouse by some of the employees of Phelps. But then they were also acquitted when they were brought to trial for that killing, and they claimed self-defense, even though they were unarmed.
Yeah, well, yeah, and chances are, because of the environment back then, the courts were all on the company side. They supported the company because the company paid a lot of taxes to them. But that's what this article here I have on the battle says was the tipping point. After they killed Sid Hatfield, within days, thousands of Union supporters had flocked to the outskirts of Marmet, a small town located near the state capital of Charleston, and led by organizers Keeney and Fred Mooney.
Yeah, and they went to petition the governor to step in and support them. The governor refused to give them redress to support their demands, and so then they were going to march through Logan County to get to Mingo County. And Logan County was strong anti-union. The sheriff in that county was receiving all kinds of bribes from the coal companies, and 40 of his deputies were paid by the coal companies, and the deputies would be in all the train stations in the county to look for any possible union organizers that were coming in and to run them out or to beat them up or to arrest them. And so the sheriff of that county was ready to go to battle and had organized several thousand to he declared that no union organizers were going to pass through his county.
Right, and I think it was something like 10,000 miners ended up in the march. Many of them were former World War I veterans and were heavily armed.
Right.
But they were met by a defensive line on Blair Mountain, I guess, before they could get where they wanted to go.
That's where the Sheriff Don Chafin had organized his men.
Yeah, men, including machine gun nests on the mountains to shoot down at the miners.
And they had some airplanes that they had hired.
Yeah, who was Mitchell was the guy that was the Air Force?
There's two sets of airplanes working here. There were the ones that the sheriff of Logan County had organized, which were dropping bombs, although I guess their aim wasn't very good. They said there weren't any casualties reported from the bombs. But then William Billy Mitchell of the U.S. Army, who was been regarded as the father of the United States Air Force. He served in France during World War I. He was on hand, and he used planes for reconnaissance and to report what was going on, but he didn't use any bombs. But he did declare that they could use air power to put an end to civil disturbance. So it was pretty early on that they were looking at that use of air power.
Yeah, and the article I have on Blair Mountain said that they dropped pipe bombs that were filled with nails and nuts and bolts to create shrapnel, and also tear gas they dropped on the miners as well.
Right, those were from the sheriff's
planes. From the sheriff's planes, correct. And ultimately, I guess they routed the miners and put an end to everything, and they bankrupted the United Mine Workers in that area, so that with lawsuits and everything, and so the Mine Workers Union was not able to continue organizing for many years later.
Yeah, I think actually it came to an end when President Warren Harding threatened to send federal troops in and to send in bombers.
And no doubt he was going to bomb the miners. Yeah,
the Union decided to withdraw.
Okay, yeah, that's a significant point, Lang. Yes, the federal troops were going to come in. And, that's something I realized years ago. People say that unions did all this work in protecting workers, and really what the unions did was force the government to take action. Because, and it was mentioned here by a congressman, I think after the Ludlow massacre, but there was a congressman who was quoted as saying something like, like I was mentioning to you a few days ago, if the government hadn't stepped in like it did in Blair Mountain, but if the government hadn't stepped in a broad sense and made these labor laws and protected labor from these abuses, then labor and capital would have destroyed each other, and America's prosperity or economic prosperity would have been strangled in the crib, because, eventually immigrants and or people in other countries are going to find out what's going on in America, and if you're constantly killing off your workers and blowing up your factories, you're not going to get much done.
Well, I can't comment on that. It's too speculative for me to get into. 'Cause a lot of immigrants came over for homesteading, apart from
during the settling of the West.
Yeah.
But then when the Industrial Revolution came along, they came over for work to get out of bad conditions in Europe.
And the protective labor laws pretty much were after Roosevelt was in office. So these early battle days, unions didn't have any protection really to organize. When Frank Keeney first came in, advocating to organize a union, he got something like 3,000 out of the 4,000 coal miners at that time in that county to sign up with the union, and then of course the coal company turned around and fired them all and blacklisted them. So,
yep. And blacklisted was where, if someone was put on a blacklist that was shared by all of the employers, of that particular industry, you couldn't get a job at any other employer once you got on the blacklist. You couldn't. There's nowhere you could go to get a job in that industry.
Yeah, and one of the things that motivated this union organizing in West Virginia was that the unions had organized coal mines in other states, and they had just recently, through strikes in those other states, achieved a 25% pay raise. And
the coal companies in West Virginia wanted to avoid that.
Right, and one of the reasons given for that, and I don't know how accurate it is, was that West Virginia was further away from where the coal was used in steel industry and in the big cities that used it for heating fuel, and so they had higher transport costs, and the companies were claiming that they couldn't afford to pay as much as the ones that had better access to the markets.
Yeah, and I've heard that argument. Yeah, and I actually am sympathetic to that argument, but for goodness sakes, if you've got to employ people under those conditions.
Yeah, if you can't pay a decent wage and make your business succeed, then you need to find another business, I guess. Yeah.
Anyway, I'd like to move on to the Pullman strike. I mentioned the town of Pullman. It was a company town, and it had the complete control of the workers that lived there. There were some that lived outside of town, but the rest of them lived in the Pullman company town. The Pullman Palace Car Company was the manufacturer of the swanky passenger rail cars from back in that day. And of course, the people lived in houses. They paid company scrip for their rent. They were paid company scrip to buy food at the store. I mean, they were basically in the control of the Pullman Palace Car Company. And according to this, when the economic depression that began in 1893, the Pullman Car Company, the owner of the Pullman, George M. Pullman, cut the wages of the workers, but didn't introduce a corresponding reduction in rents and other fees in the company town. So the people were facing starvation. So a delegation of workers went to Mr. Pullman and presented their grievances about low wages, poor living conditions, 16-hour workdays, and Pullman refused to even meet with them, and then fired all of them for coming to him and asking him, to address these issues. And so the workers at Pullman voted to go on strike, and did. And then the American Railway Union, which did not represent the workers at Pullman, but they decided to go out on strike in support. And it grew from there, and it got to a point where there were 125,000 workers on 29 railroads who had quit in sympathy. And the way the American Railway Union showed their sympathy was they refused to handle any train that had a Pullman car in it. And the story I read years ago was that it was the passenger train workers mainly that rebelled, but then Pullman decided to attach mail cars, which were Pullman cars, to freight trains. And that caused the freight train workers to quit and go out. And then there was a great deal of violence. People became desperate, obviously. The National Guard was called in. The company goons, detective agencies were brought in, and there was just generally a lot of violence, destruction of company rolling stock, and arson of company property. And once they overturned a locomotive that happened to be at the head of a train with a mail car, President Grover Cleveland pushed for a federal injunction against the unions, and basically they crushed the union with the federal power and 6,000 federal troops. It says here, by that time there were some 6,000 federal and state troops, 3,100 police, and 5,000 deputy marshals in the city, and it just became a melee. And eventually the Pullman workers lost the whole confrontation, and it severely disrupted everything, but all because, of the unfair conditions, the desperation that these people were driven to because of the company towns. Anyway, you're listening to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker here on A Pause for Thought. We're talking about labor relations, labor wars, and just a brief mention here, Lang, of a non-coal company related incident that showed the need for organization of labor back in the early 20th century. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Company. It was a garment factory. It employed a whole bunch of women. It was a 9-story tall building, and some of the women employed there were 14 years old. They were recent Italian and European Jewish immigrants who had come to the United States with their families to seek a better life, and instead, according to this Cornell University essay, they faced lives of grinding poverty and horrifying working conditions. And what happened was the upper floors of the Ash building, where the Triangle Shirtwaist Company had its operations, caught fire one Saturday afternoon near closing time, and the women could not open any of the doors to escape the building from the 9th floor, and many burned up there, died from smoke inhalation, or jumped out of the windows and landed on the concrete and died. But 146 of the 500 employees at the Triangle Shirtwaist Company were killed in that fire, and it was later shown that the conditions of the owners' other factories, they had a lot of flammable material sitting around, laying around the floor, scraps from the fabric and all that, and every place they worked in was a fire hazard, and they locked the fire exits and everything to keep workers from stealing and from going out and taking breaks and things like that, and costing them money. But
well, you see similar working conditions today in the Third World, where a lot of the garment productions have been shipped offshore.
Wasn't there one in Bangladesh? It was a garment factory, yes, and the whole building collapsed because there was no building code or whatever, or they were violating the code, and a whole bunch of workers were killed. That's true. But anyway, those are some examples there, and doggone, I wanted to talk a little bit about modern day things. But the Ludlow massacre was another one, but maybe we should move on and talk about the Upper Big Branch mine explosion, which occurred back in 2010 in West Virginia, of course, naturally, since we've been talking about West Virginia. Just got to find my notes here, but there was an explosion in a mine owned by Massey Energy in March of 2010. That killed 29 mine workers and was the worst mine disaster in the United States in the last 40 years, which I guess is not that big of a deal. I mean, mine disasters are never pretty, but it turned out it was due largely to the company, Massey Energy, failing to adhere to mine safety rules, and they were getting away with it by keeping a double set of books. And the reason I wanted to bring this up, Lang, is because a lot of people say, well, nowadays with the communication and whatnot, we don't really need unions for that purpose. Companies aren't going to do that. but we can see that they actually will. Good evening, you're on the air with a pause for thought. Can I know who's calling, please?
Hello, Wayne. This is Brian Marks calling you.
Hey, Brian.
How are y'all?
Fine.
I had a brief comment on your interesting topic for the evening. The 130th anniversary of this is going to be coming up in November. What's known in history by too few people as the Thibodeau Massacre in 1887. This is a long time ago, but was almost forgotten for many people. There's a recent book by a journalist by the name of John DeSantis that's out about this topic. It was a sugarcane worker strike in the town of Thibodeau, which is in Lafourche Parish in Louisiana, not far from here, during grinding season, led by the Knights of Labor, and that led to probably a death toll similar to Blair Mountain, 50 to 100 people. We don't really know how many people were killed. In the post-Civil War, post-Reconstruction time frame. So there's situations like this almost equivalent in magnitude that, of course, have happened much closer to.
And haven't been energetically taught in our schools, I guess.
I certainly didn't learn about it in high school. If you read Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, there's a little reference to it. That's how I first got to hear about it. But yeah, here in Louisiana, there's no historical marker, for example, if you go to Thibodeau.
I was going to ask you, if there's no museum or anything, no? There's just nothing.
Well, there is now in Houma. They just opened it, my hometown. They opened an African American museum a few months ago, and I believe this is prominently there. But for a long time, of course, people in charge preferred to not think about these things. And of course, the black community, these are majority black people who were on strike, didn't talk about it because dozens of people had been killed in the streets. So,
and dozens more would have been if they'd talked about it, yeah.
Yeah. So, thank you for the subject this evening.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Brian.
Okay.
And it's interesting, he says he didn't learn about this when he was in school. Of course, he went in Louisiana. I didn't learn anything about labor wars or the Indian Wars, for that matter, until my 1 year in college. I hate to say, until I was in college, because that implies that I actually accomplished something with it. But during my 1 year in college, one of my teachers spent the first half of the semester teaching the Indian Wars, and that's where I got my eyes opened about what really happened there. And the other half of the semester was about the labor wars, and that's where I learned a lot of, began to learn about what went on with labor and how they were treated and all that. But I did want to finish up here by pointing out that you know something like in the modern time, people also say that we don't need unions anymore because companies just won't do that sort of thing. Labor's too mobile, things like that. But as I was saying, at the Upper Big Branch mine in West Virginia in 2010, they had been short-circuiting or neglecting their safety regulations, and they did not have proper ventilation in the mine, and that's important to move a lot of the coal dust out, that they produce while they're drilling and everything and digging. And the mine exploded and killed 29 miners. And something else I learned in this, which shouldn't have surprised me, but the Center for Public Integrity got a Pulitzer Prize for a study it did that exposed how sophisticated places like Johns Hopkins University Hospital was taking huge fees from coal companies, and just coincidentally, I guess they claimed, were minimizing the number of diagnoses for black lung disease. And they also showed in this study that company doctors that the miners would go see and the company would pay for, were routinely minimizing symptoms that workers would complain about and trying to hide the fact that so many of them had black lung disease so the companies wouldn't have to pay the benefits.
Right.
And that's in March of 2010. So these people need protection. Labor needs protection. And really the only people that can be counted on to achieve it is the workers themselves. And so it doesn't change. There are always companies that are willing to cut costs or cut corners in order to improve their profits. And I suspect it's only going to get worse, really, with the increasing competition and the demands by stockholders for better dividends. You got anything you want to wrap up with?
Well, I was just, from that call we had, it sounds like it might be a worthy project for someone to take on a People's History of Louisiana in
The labor history, you mean, or just in general?
Well, people's history in general about what's not reported. He referred to the book People's History of the United States. And I'm sure there's lots of overlooked history here.
I'm sure you're right, yeah.
That it would be valuable for people to have access to that information.
Yeah, you know, as if the black people in this part of the country hadn't suffered enough, you know, due to slavery and racism and the discrimination in real estate and property markets. Now we find out that the labor movement had the same problems down here for them as well. Some people just can't get a good deal, I guess, or get a fair deal. But yeah, that would be interesting to find out, although it would be more sad news, I guess. But one other thing I did want to mention during the show, there are a lot of people that say that if workers don't like their jobs, they can move. But back in around the beginning of the 20th century, they didn't have that much mobility. America was largely rural, didn't have a lot of roads, and workers just could not move around that much. Anyway, Lang, we got to go. We're out of time. You've been listening to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker here on A Pause for Thought. We're talking about the labor wars tonight. We thank you for listening. We got to go. You have a good night.
Thank you.
Support for WHYR.